Sorry, I'm just going to move a few things around on my screen. It's a bit distracting there. So thank you for today. Yes, so we're going to be looking at neurodiverse young people, children. So yes, I'm Tracy Bowyer. I'm the parenting coordinator from the ADHD Foundation, but more importantly, I am also parent to a neurodivergent family. So I think that's far more important in terms of my background. Let me just move my screen on. Oh, some problems. Here we go. So first of all, what I want to just very quickly talk about is what is neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is a term that was coined in the 1990s by Australian sociologist Judy Singh, and it's basically used to describe, this term has been used to describe natural variations in the human brain. So it basically relates to differences in how people think, how we process, and how we learn, and it's also how people experience and interact with the world around them, really. So the concept means is there's no right way, there's no correct way of thinking, of learning or behaving. And the word neurodiversity basically refers to the diversity of all people. But quite often what we find at the moment is it's often used in the context of autism, of ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions. So in terms of those neurodivergent conditions, 20% of the population, or 1 in 5 of those of people in general, are going to be neurodivergent. So, and as with all people, you know, all of our neurodivergent young people are children. They're going to have their own unique strengths, they're going to have their own unique traits, differences, needs and challenges, and so we're going to talk about some of those as we go through the session today. Thinking about the types of neurodivergent conditions there are, so dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, autism, dyscalculia, dysgraphia and Tourette's. But today our focus is going to be primarily looking at autism and ADHD. So first of all, what is autism? So autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, so a different way of thinking, a different way of processing information, processing the world, and also differences in how our senses take in information. So as I've said, every autistic young person is going to be unique. All of our children are going to have their own unique characteristics, their own unique personality. And those characteristics in terms of autism can vary from one person to the next. So thinking about the presentation of autism as well, you know, our young people may well present one way in one environment and another in another. So the presentation can also depend on maybe sensory challenges, whether our young people have had enough sleep that day, what their diet has been like, whether they're in good health or not, what types of activities they may well have completed. Also in terms of the presentation of autism, it's going to massively change in terms of their development, so their maturation as they get older. That it may well look one way as they are children and young people now, and look very different through the lifespan as they mature. In terms of getting a diagnosis of autism, our children and young people will have to have met a criteria that is set out in the diagnostic manual. So the current diagnostic manuals are the DSM-5 or the ICD-10, which is moving into the ICD-11. So I'm not going to sort of go on too much about that, but in terms of the criteria and what that looks at for our autistic young people, it looks at differences with social communication and social interaction. It looks at repetitive type behaviours. We might see highly focused interest or special interests, hobbies, and sensory processing differences is also included in that. Now, when we look, I'll go into those in a little bit more detail in a second, but when we think about those differences, they need to be persistent and present since early childhood. So our children that we're thinking about now are our early years, our primary age children, that need those challenges, that presentation need to be present from childhood. It might be for older young people or adults that they are not necessarily picked up on or identified, but when we reflect back, we can see that those characteristics were certainly present, even if they weren't identified or picked up on at that time. And there needs to be, unfortunately, to get a diagnosis to be impacting on our young people in a way that they are having persistent difficulties. So thinking about what that might look like. So some examples of the presentation, it might be that for some of our young people, if we think about communication, for example, it might be for some of our children that we have children who maybe don't use any language or use very little language, have very few words, spoken words. We might see for some of our young people that they repeat words or they repeat certain phrases, so something called echolalia. Certainly for my little girl, that's how she learned language and how she continues to learn language. She uses a lot of learned phrases, repeated phrases, and is able to put them into context. We might have young people who have lots of language, and are able to articulate themselves really well, or we might have some young people who rely on the use of signs, of gestures, of pictures, communication boards, or technology to be able to communicate. Some of our young people, even if they have lots of language, we might find that their understanding of language may well be quite limited. We might have young people who have a very literal perspective on language. They may sort of not really see the point or dislike things like small talk or sarcasm or jokes, for example. Some of our young people might need additional time in terms of processing information. So they might sort of need, when we ask something of them, when we give them an instruction, they might just need a little bit longer to process what we've asked of them and to formulate that response and to respond to that. Some of our young people as well, in terms of play, we might see non-traditional play. So we might see things for our younger people like, so lining things up, for example, sorting things by colour, maybe watching the same TV programmes over and over, or the same clips over and over. Sometimes we can see that as well. And for some of our young people, they may prefer to play on their own. Some may like to play with others, and for some it might be that when they are playing with others, it's on their terms. It's when they are comfortable to do so. Some of our young people can often struggle with new situations, new environments, unexpected change. They might get anxious in busy situations as well, or busy environments. And certainly a lot of our young people often experience sensory processing differences, so differences in terms of how they interpret sensory input. Also, we can see for some of our young people that they may have difficulties in terms of managing their emotional regulation. And that can be because of challenges around communication differences. It can be because of unpredictable situations. It might be because of sensory differences, unexpected changes. Our young people often can have the amazing ability to be able to hyper-focus or concentrate on something for long periods of time, particularly things that they are very interested in, or maybe specific types of areas, specific hobbies, specific interests. And they're often a font of information in those areas that they have a strong interest in. And then also we might see some repetitive type movements or actions or sounds, and that might be when our young people are excited, or sometimes we can see that also to manage dysregulation. In terms of ADHD, so attention hyperactivity disorder, to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, then the DSM-5 states that there needs to be a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity. So this might challenge a lot of what people believe about ADHD, because a lot of people assume that there needs to be that hyperactive element of ADHD to receive a diagnosis. So for our young people, our younger children, quite often they can appear hyperactive. So in terms of ADHD diagnosis, it's often not considered until after the age of 6, because in terms of general development, sometimes our younger people can present as always on the go and appear hyperactive. So it tends to be looked at from the age of 6 onwards. But also, if we think about in terms of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, sorry. So within that overarching ADHD diagnosis, there are 3 subtypes. So for some of our young people, like I said, they may not necessarily present with that hyperactivity or that impulsivity element of ADHD, and that's a little bit of a myth, like I say, in terms of that needs to be present to get a diagnosis. So the 3 subtypes of ADHD that we often see are inattentive type ADHD. We can also see ADHD impulsive hyperactivity type, and also that combined type. And the combined type tends to be the most common diagnosed type of ADHD. In terms of getting a diagnosis of ADHD, our young people need to have those characteristics of ADHD, which I'll talk about in a second. Those characteristics of ADHD need to be present before the age of 12. So that doesn't mean, like I said, in terms of autism, that doesn't necessarily mean that all our young people are going to get that diagnosis before the age of 12. And it doesn't mean that after the age of 12, our young people won't be considered. What it does mean is that, again, when we reflect back, when we think about our young people in terms of their development, then we identify and recognise that those characteristics were during childhood. But certainly for our young children that we're seeing now, the primary age young children that we're talking about today, those characteristics will be evident, and they need to be present in 2 or more settings. So quite often what will happen if your young person is being assessed for ADHD, then what will happen is you'll be asked to complete a rating scale to identify if those characteristics are present in the home setting, and quite often the education setting will also be asked to complete one of those rating scales to determine if those characteristics are present in both settings. But thinking about what that presentation might look like in terms of ADHD, so thinking about what inattention might look like, it might look like for some of our young people that they've just got that short attention span. They may have difficulties with sustaining attention. They might quite often lose focus, or maybe they're easily sidetracked, may have difficulties concentrating. We can see time blindness, so the inability to really sort of sense the passage of time. It might be that they underestimate or overestimate how much time has passed. You know, an hour might feel like 10 minutes, or 10 minutes might feel like an hour. We can see poor time management for some of our children and young people. They might leave things unfinished, so we might find that we give them instructions and they aren't able to follow through on those instructions. So we might see sort of half-started schoolwork or half-started chores, for example. We might see them being quite forgetful or losing things. So again, you know, we ask them to complete a task and they've forgotten what they were doing, or they're distracted and get, you know, their attention's taken to something else. They might lose things that are necessary for tasks. So might see them losing pencils or books, for example, or even losing their PE kits, or coming home without parts of their uniform. We can see for some of our young people that they are maybe disorganised. They have real challenges maybe in organising themselves. That might be physically or mentally as well. And also being able to stay on task for long periods of time might be a challenge for some of our young people. They might, you know, start off doing their homework, for example, and then again just get easily distracted, find it really difficult to spend longer periods of time doing those pieces of work. And sometimes our young people can maybe even present as almost daydreamers, you know, in a little world of their own. Thinking about impulsivity and how that might present. So young people who make those spur of the moment decisions, no thought or consequences of the impact that those decisions may well have on themselves or on others, and might interrupt or intrude on conversations, so butting in, blurting out answers. We might see for some of our young people trees and facts, so that impulsive brain putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 7. Often for some of our young people, they're repeating the same mistakes over and over. We might find ourselves saying, how many times have I told you not to do such and such? And also we can see they might have difficulties with taking turns or waiting. So games can be, you know, where turn taking might be difficult, queuing can be difficult, turn taking within conversations can sometimes be challenging for some of our young people. And then thinking about that hyperactive element of ADHD, so we can see lots and lots of physical energy. I talk about them being almost like those Duracell bunnies, always on the go. We might see them always fidgeting, always touching things, always fiddling, nail biting, skin picking, always swinging on chairs. We might see that for excessive physical movement, so running and climbing, for example. But also for some of our young people, we might not necessarily see lots of outward hyperactivity. We might see for some of our young people that it's actually just that feeling of restlessness, not being able to settle. Busy brains that can't switch off, always thinking about something, always got lots of tabs open and always on the go. And also in terms of hyperactivity, what we can also see is excessive talk, always chatting away, always got something to talk about. When we think about autism, when we think about ADHD, quite often, and I've experienced this as a parent, for my young people when they were first diagnosed as autistic, as both my children are, when they were first diagnosed, quite often what I would be asked is, how mild or how severe is their autism? And certainly it's not helpful to think about it, neither autism or ADHD, in terms of it being a linear concept. So how our children present will vary massively from day to day and be influenced by many, many factors. So including, like I said earlier, how they've slept, what environment they're in, if they're experiencing any sensory sensitivities, what's their emotional well-being like at that time, what types of demands are being put on them. So really, in terms of how our young people present, they can often, we talk about it being more like a cognitive equalizing, and dependent on all of those factors, dependent on situation to situation, environment to environment, they may look, the presentation may look very differently. So if back in the day, if you're as old as me, when we used to have LPs and stereo systems, we used to have graphic equalizers, and we would adjust those graphic equalizers with the bass and the treble, etc., to get the music coming out of that system to be just right. We would tweak that, and it can look very much the same for our young people in terms of support that they may well need, and how the ADHD and how autism is for them in any given situation and any given environment. Also, something that we need to consider in terms of autism and ADHD is co-occurrence. So co-occurrence is basically having more than one condition. So alongside of autism, alongside of ADHD, we will see a co-occurring condition. So we talk about co-occurrence being the rule, not the exception. So the majority of our young people are likely to have another co-occurring condition. So again, thinking about my children, so my daughter, for example, is autistic. She also has a learning disability. She has dyspraxia. She has significant sensory challenges. So quite often we're not just going to see autism in isolation. We're not just going to see ADHD in isolation. It may well be that for some of our young people, they only have a single diagnosis. It might be that they haven't had those additional diagnoses, and that could be for many reasons. It might be because there are long waiting lists, so they may be on lengthy assessment waiting lists. It might be that those other conditions have not necessarily been picked up because of sometimes there are overlapping characteristics across conditions. So it might be that they haven't been identified. It might be that for some of our young people, it's been acknowledged that there are additional traits of other conditions. However, it might be that there is not enough of those traits or characteristics to meet the diagnostic threshold for some of those conditions. So, but it's important, I feel, to be aware of our young people, all of those characteristics and all of those, particularly if there are support needs, but also those strengths, so that we can support our young people in, using those strengths, and we can focus on those strengths to meet our young people's support needs and to help them, I suppose, achieve as much, as much, I can't get this, sort of think about the way I'm trying to put this, I suppose, but trying to achieve their full potential is what I'm trying to say. So thinking about co-occurrence in particular around autism and around ADHD. If we think about our autistic young people, 30 to 80% of our autistic young people are also likely to meet that criteria for ADHD. And on the flip of that is that 20 to 50% of our ADHD young people are likely to meet that criteria for an autism diagnosis. So prior to 2013, it used to be that our young people wouldn't have been able to be diagnosed with both autism and ADHD, but now since the introduction of the DSM-5, that they can certainly have that dual diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. In addition to those core characteristics, those core presentation of autism and ADHD that I've mentioned, our young people can also have some differences in terms of their executive functions. So executive functions are sometimes referred to as the management system of the brain, and they are developing through childhood. They develop through childhood, through adolescence, and they don't fully mature until the mid to late 20s. So for some of our young people, we can often see challenges for our young people in one or more of these areas. So just thinking about what that might look like for our young people. So thinking about impulse control, not thinking before they're acting, maybe not considering those consequences, doing or saying things that might be inappropriate, engaging in risk-taking behaviour, that sort of jump first, think later type of attitudes, I suppose. So sometimes we can see for some of our young people the challenges around that impulse control, having that thought and responding to it. Emotional control, so being able to regulate our emotions, being able to keep feelings in check. We might see for some of our young people that they have difficulties with managing their emotions. Excuse me. They might have difficulties with controlling their emotional responses to certain things. We might see that they have big emotional responses, or we might see that they withdraw or isolate. Flexible thinking, so thinking about our young people being able to adjust to changes, particularly unexpected changes. We might have young people who really struggle with unexpected change and become really frustrated or distressed if things change unexpectedly. Working memory, so being able to keep key information in mind whilst we're using it. So for some of our young people, it might be that when if we give them a task, if we give them a couple of instructions, that they are able to sort of get through the first few instructions, but really have difficulty in recalling the rest of those instructions. So for some of our young people, actually remembering, processing and acting on that information can be a challenge. Self-monitoring, so being able to judge how we're doing in the moment, being able to check in with ourselves, being able to adjust our behaviours. Again, for some of our young people, they may have some challenges in being able to do that. Planning and prioritising, so being able to set a goal, being able to identify a goal, and then being able to put a plan in place to be able to meet that. Avoiding procrastination. For some of our young people, they might not be able to prioritise what is the most important task. We might find that they tend to do things that are easier, or they might tend to do things that they prefer to do rather than doing what is the priority. Task initiation, so actually being able to start a task independently. For some of our young people, they might not know where to start, they might not know how to start, they might need us to sort of break that down for them, to tell them how to be able to start, break it down into manageable chunks for them to be able to do that. For some of our young people, it might be that they can start a task but actually end in that task and move it on to another task, maybe something that's difficult. So thinking about transitions, stopping one task to move on to the next, particularly if it's the task that they're doing is something that they enjoy, something that they're engaged in. And then organisation, so being able to organise themselves physically, so being able to maybe order their personal space, maybe their rooms are really messy, maybe their school bag is always full of all different papers, maybe they're not able to remember when they need their PE kit, when they need their swim kit, for example. So For lots of our young people, we can see challenges in terms of their executive function. I think one of the important things that I feel we should take away in terms of those executive functions is in terms of the development those executive functions for our young people who are neurodivergent. So for some of our young people, those executive functions may have a delay in the development of by up to a third. So if we think about all those skills that we've just talked about there, for some of our young people, if we think about what we would expect, for example, our 10-year-old to be able to do in terms of those skills, and if they are, if those skills are a third behind in their development, are we actually seeing skills more in line with the 7-year-old? So, you know, if we think about what would our expectations be of a 10-year-old in terms of being able to organise themselves for school, in terms of being able to dress themselves, in terms of being able to cope with changes, in terms of knowing what is happening throughout the day, whether they need their PE kit or not. Would those expectations, being able to organise themselves, being able to plan and prepare, being able to stay on task, would we have those same expectations of a 10-year-old as we would of our 7-year-olds? Would our expectations of our 6-year-olds be the same for our 4-year-olds? So for our young people who are autistic, or young people who have ADHD, they may well be operating up to a third behind their peers in relation to their ability to utilise those executive functions in terms of the development of those executive functions. Also in terms of emotional maturation, so we might all see that delay in terms of emotional maturation. So are you seeing a big emotional responses that seem immature for their age? So again, thinking about our 10-year-olds, are you seeing emotional responses that are more in keeping with that of a 7-year-old? For your 6-year-olds, so their emotional responses seem to be that of more of a much younger child, of a 4-year-old. So just thinking about what are our expectations of our young people in terms of what we expect them to be able to do, in terms of being able to use those executive functions, but also in terms of emotional responses. So I did a piece of work with some college staff recently in terms of the young people that they support. So they are supporting young people sort of 16, 17 and 18. And when we talked about this, we talked about what their expectations were in terms of these young people being able to organise themselves to complete pieces of work, to be able to get to college, to be able to engage with college, to utilise all of those skills, and also what were the expectations in terms of the emotional responses that they were seeing from these young people. And what they realised was these 16, 17, 18-year-olds were actually, in terms of their ability to use those executive functions, in terms of their ability to organise themselves and plan and prepare and get through the day and utilise those skills, actually they were far more, you know, they were operating more in lines of those with 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. So again, just thinking about that, because I certainly think that that's important in terms of how we support and how we manage with our young people. Thinking about sensory needs, so for some of our young people, you know, like I've said, they will experience some sensory challenges. So in terms of sensory, it's just how our brain and our body manages and processes information from all of our senses, and that can affect how we react to things. So we've all got sensory systems, we've all got sensory preferences, we've all got sensory sensitivities, and what happens is we receive information from all of those 8 senses. So our touch system, our visual system, our auditory system, our hearing, our olfactory or our sense of smell, our taste. So they're all our external senses, but we also have an input that comes from internal senses as well. So we've got our balance system or our vestibular system. So I talk about that being almost like our body's spirit level, and it provides information about movement, about gravity and change in head position. We've also got our proprioceptive system, which is about body awareness. So I think about that as being like our body sat nav. It tells us where the different parts of our body are, how they're moving, helps us to maintain our posture. Alongside that vestibular system, helps us to control our movements as well. So, you know, knowing where our feet are when we're walking, so we don't have to look at our feet, knowing how much speed or force to use in our movement. So, for example, if we drink from a cup, you know, we don't move the cup so fast and so harshly that we crash the cup into our teeth. We know exactly how much force, how much speed, how much pressure to use. And then also that interoceptive system. So what's happening internally for our young people, what's happening inside their bodies, helps us to identify things like hunger, thirst, pain, whether we need to go to the bathroom or not, whether we're, you know, whether we are hot or not, so those types of sensations. And we can have, our young people can have challenges in regulating those sensory system sometimes. So for some of our young people, we might see that they've got sensory processing challenges because they're over responsive or oversensitive. We might see for some of our young people that they are under responsive or undersensitive to some sensory input, or we might see that they exhibit sensory seeking type behaviour. So they're actively seeking out sensory input. Now, for some of our young people, they may be over responsive in some areas, they may be under responsive in other areas, and they may experience sensory seeking type behaviours. They could be a mixture of all three. So thinking about what that might look like for some of our young people. So if they're oversensitive, we might see for some of our young people that they are very sensitive to certain inputs, very sensory defensive. They may try to avoid certain types of sensory inputs. So things like, you know, they may hear sounds from very far away. They might become distressed with certain types of sounds. They may be very sensitive to light. For example, it might be certain types of light. It might be that they really struggle in terms of certain types of fabric, certain types of textures. So we can often see young people who struggle with seams, labels, tags. Maybe they prefer short sleeves versus long sleeves. It might be that, you know, they struggle with scratchy shirts, school ties, blazers. So we can often see challenges around that. Disliking certain textures, not just to touch, but also thinking about young people who struggle with certain types of textures in terms of food. So we might see for some of our young people that they are picky or fussy eaters because they have a low tolerance for certain textures, certain tastes. Also, in terms of smells, for some of our young people, they can be very sensitive to certain smells. But thinking about also those internal systems. So for some of our young people, they might really struggle with heights. They might really struggle with movement type activities. So thinking about escalators, thinking about lifts, thinking about going up and down stairs, even about playground equipment where their feet are off the ground. So roundabout, slides, swings. They can really struggle with those types of activities and might sort of start these. They might struggle with unexpected noise, might struggle with loud noise, might struggle with lots of noise, not being able to filter out certain lots of noise or specific type of noises. So quite often we can see challenges around babies crying, hand dryers in public toilets can often be a challenge. Under-responsive or under-sensitive to sensory input. So that might look like our young people sort of taking longer to register that sensory input. So they might not register, might not necessarily pay attention to input that other people may well notice. So thinking about maybe if there are sudden or loud noises, maybe they don't notice them or don't necessarily react the way we would expect them to. For some of our young people, thinking about in terms of clothing, so it might be that, you know, for these young people, they don't register if their clothes are twisted. Or so thinking about socks that have been put on upside down, shoes on the wrong feet, for example, cardigans halfway down their shoulders, you know, pants halfway down, or even pulled up those sort of Simon Cowell type trousers. So they might not notice when they're clothes, where ordinarily we would expect them to feel uncomfortable because of the way the clothes are. They might not notice that. They might not sort of show any awareness of pain. They may not register pain the same. They might, maybe they engage in things like, going on those playground equipment, going on those roundabouts, and they don't sort of register, they don't feel dizzy after engaging in those types of activities. And then sensory seeking behaviours. So for some of our young people, they might see them constantly actively seeking out that sensory input. So we might see our young people who are always climbing, always spinning, always jumping, always pacing, always touching things, always smelling things, always tasting things. In terms of emotional dysregulation, so for a lot of our young people, they can often experience emotional dysregulation and struggle to be able to regulate throughout the day. So those big emotions, if we think about, for some of our young people, if they've got communication differences, if they are experiencing challenges with those executive functions, if they have some sensory sensitivities, then quite often we can see our young people becoming dysregulated and maybe going into that fight, flight or freeze response. So for some of our young people, it might be that, they because of that stress response, because they are dysregulated, we might see that fight response might look like our young people becoming irritable, being frustrated. It may come across as if they're angry or aggressive, or as if they're in a rage, but actually what they're experiencing is they're overwhelmed and they're experiencing dysregulation. It may be for a number of factors. And so thinking about, what are the triggers for that? Why are our young people feeling stressed, feeling anxious, and which means that that leads them into that fight response. For some of our young people, it might be that they go into that flight response, so they're feeling panicked, they look fearful, they're anxious, they're worried. We might see them trying to leave environments, leave classrooms, leave the living room, isolating themselves, wanting to just, when they come in, just get into their bedroom, leaving situations. Maybe they're running off without any thought for their safety, because again, they're just so dysregulated that they're feeling overwhelmed. Or it might be for some of our young people that they disassociate, they almost withdraw into their minds, they shut down, they become maybe they become over compliant. So what they're trying to do is just go under the radar, be unnoticed. So we can see that freeze response as well for some of our young people, and just thinking about what that might look like for some of our young people. So thinking, quite often it might be one thing that could lead to them becoming overwhelmed. So if we just see on screen here, we've got what we call our stress response curve. And at the bottom, we've got our young people, they may be calm, thinking rationally. And at the top here, we've got what we call a boom moment. So the boom moment is when our young people may experience dysregulation. They may become overwhelmed. And so we might see, like I say, we might see meltdown, we might see our young people having big emotional responses, we might see our young people shutting down, we might see them withdrawing, we might see them isolating themselves. So for some of our young people, this is when they've reached massive overwhelm. And what can happen is, it could seem that for some of our young people that they very quickly escalate into that boom moment. It might be that there is one trigger, something happens, and they reach that boom moment. So for my little girl, one of the triggers for her is, she can be actually quite calm, enjoying herself, and then a baby cries, and that is the trigger for her. She very quickly can get to that period of overwhelm. If there is a baby crying, she's very sensitive to that particular noise. But quite often what happens is, these things are cumulative for our young people. So it's not necessarily just one thing, there can be a number of things. So to be able to support our young people to calm, to regulate, we need to be able to understand the triggers. So thinking about what we've just talked about, for some of our young people, it might be about those sensory sensitivities. So one of the things that they might be sensitive to is that touch system, for example, and something that is quite common for young people who experience challenges with the touch system can be when they're not being able to tolerate personal care tasks. So it might be that, you know, in the morning, every single morning before school, they have to have their face washed, teeth cleaned, hair brushed. So this is certainly the case for my little girl. So that would mean she would move up that stress response curve just a little bit. Then it might be that they struggle with aspects of those school uniform. So, you know, those scratchy shirts, those school ties, those school blazers. So they move up that curve a little bit more. Then it might be, you know, because of those touch sensitivities, they don't cope very well with unpredictable touch. They have to navigate busy corridors, busy playgrounds, busy classrooms where people may touch them unpredictably, brush against them. Also thinking about that auditory system, maybe they struggle again with those busy environments because they struggle to filter out noise, they struggle with loud noises, unexpected noises. So again, moving them up that stress response curve. Then thinking about those executive function challenges. So for our young people who maybe they struggle with remembering what equipment they need for school, maybe they've forgotten that they need to do their spellings, maybe they've forgotten that they needed their swimming kit, maybe that they've forgotten that they needed their PE kit, maybe they're struggling to retain information. The teacher at the front of the class is explaining what is needed to complete the next task in school in the lesson, and because of some work and memory challenges, they're able to retain all that information and complete that task. So for some of our young people, again, you can see them why they would move up that curve. Then we might see some challenges with processing information, the demands put on them throughout the day, communication differences, unexpected changes, transitions. So you can see how for our young people, all of these things that they have to cope with, deal with and navigate throughout the day can lead to them escalating up that curve to where they become overwhelmed. And so what we need to do really is identify what are the things our young people are likely to struggle with, and what are those triggers likely to be, so we can support them to be able to put strategies in place so that they don't become overwhelmed, they don't feel overwhelmed, they don't reach that point where they're distressed. So just thinking about how we can support our young people, identifying and minimizing triggers. So maybe it might be helpful to complete a diary. I certainly did this with my little girl when she was going through a period of constantly experiencing overwhelm. I completed a diary to try and unpick if there were particular places, particular environments, particular activities that she struggled with. And maybe that is something that you can use to help you identify if there are some specific triggers or specific areas that are causing your young person to be overwhelmed. Also, you know, for some of our young people, it might be using anger as an example. It might be that for our young people that they haven't got an understanding of what those emotions, what those feelings are like. So, and they associate the behaviour, the response to the feeling, rather than separating them. So doing pieces of work around with our young people about what are they feeling and what is their response to that feeling. So using anger as an example, you know, if they're feeling angry, that's okay. It's okay to feel angry. We might not agree with their reasons for feeling angry, but it's okay to feel angry. We're not going to tell them it's not okay to feel angry, but what is not okay is maybe their response to anger. So supporting our young people to be able to recognise that, to separate those two things, to understand what their feelings feel like, but also to understand how that behaviour looks and whether that's okay or not. And also helping them to recognise their own responses, recognise their own reactions. So for some of our young people, it might be that, you know, they only know when they're at the top of that curve. They only know when they're in that boom moment. So talk to them about emotional patterns, model your own, talk about how you feel, how you respond to things, how you might the physical sensations you might have, how you might be able to do things differently, and you visualize that, support our young people visually with those things. So use things like rating scales, use things like the stress response curve to support our young people to identify for themselves how they feel, what may cause them to escalate up that curve, and think about how we can externalize that for our young people. So some additional strategies in terms of supporting our young people as well is having empathy for our young people. So there's a myth that our young people don't feel empathy. Certainly when we talk about our autistic young people, there's this myth that our autistic young people don't feel empathy, and actually what it tends to be is that they may communicate that empathy differently than we do. But actually, you know, what about our empathy? Do we understand the world from their point of view? Do we understand how they are perceiving and experiencing things? So for us to really sort of engage with them from their point of view, I always find, certainly for my eldest son, that, you know, when he's struggling, humour often is a good way to support him, and he's, you know, he's got a fantastic sense of humour. He loves nothing more than a good joke. He tells quite a lot of jokes himself, and not necessarily the best of jokes, but you know, humour can be a really good way of supporting some of our young people's special interests as well. You know, again, getting into what they are interested, using their interests as a way in. My son loves nothing more than he's a font of information about all the things he's interested in. He's fascinating. So, you know, not get involved with your young people. Simplifying language, particularly if they're starting to become anxious or stressed, reducing language, maybe breaking things down into simple instructions, not sort of using lots of language, not insisting on eye contact. For some of our young people, they can find that difficult. So, you know, don't insist on that. Give processing time. We talk about the 10 rule. So, you know, counting to 10 once we've asked something of them or given instructions, to give them time to think about that and formulate a response. Support transitions, so 5-minute warnings, maybe visually supporting those transitions, letting them know what's coming next, and think about the environment. Think about if they're going to be overloaded, if there's any sensory sensitivities around that. And then support your young people visually, so pictures, lists, schedules, calendars, whatever works for them. If they struggle with managing change or anything new, plan ahead. You know, when you're planning something, try and familiarise it as much as possible. You know, when we talk about making it as familiar as we can. Also trying to establish a routine around that. If we're going somewhere new, can we try and keep the routine either side the same? Can we let them know what to expect? Can we support that visually by giving them a timetable of what to expect? Making things as familiar and as predictable as possible. And also, if there is going to be some unexpected change, give it as much notice as possible, you know, not just expecting them to deal with that, even if it's just to stop in the moment and say, I'm really sorry, but this has changed. This is what you can expect when we go into here right now. And just making it as familiar as we can, as quickly as we can. And remember to transition, signal transitions, let our young people know. In terms of support around sensory needs, around regulation, proprioceptive type activities can be really helpful. Any type of activities that involve muscles and joints can be calming. Heavy jobs, deep pressure, resistive activities, vibration. So there's some examples on screen there. I won't go through them all because I'm conscious that I am very quickly running out of time. But also some more ideas there in terms of those proprioceptive type activities. You know, just think about heavy jobs, anything resistive and deep pressure can be really helpful. And I will just finish on this slide in terms of those final strategies. So for some of our young people, thinking about how we can help them regulate, help them, prevent them from reaching overwhelm. So thinking about building quiet time, and do they need some chill out time? Do they need that built into their day or a specific time? So maybe when they come home from school, we don't even speak to them, we put no demands on them, we give them an hour to be able to sort of have some chill out time, some quiet time to themselves. Physical activities, you know, so I've already touched on that, so activities that use those muscles, those joints, so walking, swimming, riding a bike, using gym equipment, going to the park, boxing, all of those things can be helpful. Sensory items, having a sensory toolkit, so it might be that we have weighted equipment, we have headphones, we have ear defenders, we have resistive type fidgets. They can all be helpful for our young people. Sports bottle drinks, chewy snacks. Also teach your young person, or things like progressive muscle relaxation that they can use anywhere, deep breathing techniques. There's lots of things on YouTube or apps now that we can help with all of that. And also deep pressure, massage, small spaces, all of those things can be helpful for our young people, as can weighted equipment, so weighted blankets, weighted lap pads. And then technology can be really helpful for our young people in terms of focusing on things to help distract. So it might be that we use technology, whether that be their iPads, music, podcasts, audio books. It just means that there can be a really good distraction. I certainly use technology if we go somewhere that I know my little girl's going to struggle. And then also teaching yoga or meditation techniques for our young people that they can use anywhere that they go. So we've had a whistle-stop tour. Conscious that I crammed a lot of information into a small period of time. Thank you very much.
Oh, amazing, Tracy. Thank you so much. There was so much advice there, so I think it's been really helpful for everyone. We'll just quickly move on to the Q&A, because I know, like you said, we're short of time, aren't we? But we've got a couple of questions to ask you, so I'll get on with them. So there's one. Because the symptoms of dyslexia and ADHD are so similar, do you feel it's beneficial to pursue an ADHD diagnosis alongside a dyslexia diagnosis, which is the child's already diagnosed with dyslexia, to enable the child to gain the right support in the senior school?
I think that for our young people, if they are showing those characteristics of ADHD, then for me personally, I do think it's a very personal view, but for me personally, I feel it's important for our young people to, be able to identify if they have challenges, what those challenges are, and why they have those challenges. And whilst there can be overlap, there can be very different reasons for those challenges sometimes. So certainly for me, if it was my daughter and I suspected ADHD alongside dyslexia, I would certainly pursue an assessment, at the very least, just so that if there are any unidentified support needs, that they can then be supported. Yes, so I feel it would be helpful, it would be beneficial, and certainly all of these conditions, there can be overlap, and that can make it very difficult to tease out, I suppose, sometimes, if there is another co-occurring condition. But the assessment, that's what that's there for, and then to help support our young people as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question. I organise my 12-year-old's school bag every morning to avoid meltdowns as we leave the house. Is this unhelpful in the long term? If I leave it to him and he forgets the essential items and then there's consequences at school, I don't know whether I'm helping or hindering in the long term.
So maybe it's something that you work on of an evening, you build it into your routine. So part of your evening routine might be that there's time to prepare a bag, and especially if they've got their routine on the wall, and literally put that in there, prepare a school bag. Another thing that can often be helpful as well, especially because he's 12, and so in high school they often have different lessons for different days, so it could be that it's listed each day what he will need for each lesson, so he can literally run through that. So what if he'll need a swim kit, if he'll need a PE kit, what books will he need for whatever lessons he's got, does he need to check whether he has any homework with that. So yeah, it can be definitely helpful to maybe work on that in the evening when you're not sort of under those time constraints, which you are in the morning, trying to get out the door to do that school run. You can build it in as part and parcel of the structure of that evening routine. But also, you know, even if that's going to be difficult, think about maybe practicing art during school holidays or during weekends. Maybe if they go to football, for example, so if they go to football, having that as built in as if they go on a Saturday morning, having that list there for them to prepare their football bag, and you can practice it on a day when there aren't as many demands. So think about how you can be creative with practicing those skills. Sometimes for our young people as well, you know, they might sort of not transfer those skills. We might need to support them with that. But yeah, I would definitely build it into the schedule, but when there's not those time demands, when there's not as much pressure to get out the door.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question. So please could you say a little more about how to use young people's strengths to help them achieve, maybe an example for the classroom setting?
So I would be looking for all our young people, what is it that it depends what their strengths are. Those strengths are going to be unique to them, but what are us, use their interests as well. What are they going to be motivated by? We find for our young people, you know, if they're interested in something, if they're motivated by something, they often give it absolutely 100%. So for example, you know, if they are doing a project on something, can we use their interests to encourage them then to be able to use? They often have really good, like I said, my son is a font of knowledge about something that he's interested in. So if we can link that to their interests, if we can link whatever it is that we're asking them to do to things that motivate them and they're interested in, they find exciting, they find novel, you know, then that can certainly be a way to harness our young people in terms of their engagement, what they're likely to produce. They're more likely to be more invested in that. I don't know if that's a helpful example.
Okay, thank you. And last couple of questions, because I know we're running out of time. Would you recommend homeschooling for a 4-year-old autistic daughter? She's very dysregulated in school, or is she too young and would it be better for her to stay at school?
I'm not really, I don't really feel, you know, that is obviously going to be unique to your circumstances. I certainly wouldn't recommend homeschooling, or not one way or another. I would get some advice around that. I know certainly for me, I can only share my experience with my daughter, and it was something I certainly considered. I didn't go down that route, I will say. But for my little girl, you know, from a very young age, she was very dysregulated from nursery all the way through. And even though, you know, her early year setting and then her primary school setting worked really hard in terms of supporting her needs, neither of them were very successful placements for her, and caused a lot of anxiety and stress. We worked really closely with the school to try and identify ways that she could be supported. Unfortunately for my little girl, what happened was we needed an alternative educational setting because she really did struggle. So I wouldn't personally recommend for you one way or another. I would certainly maybe take some advice around that, maybe look at the pros and cons of both, look at the impact it's having. Is everything that can be done being provided in terms of support for your young person? Have you been able to identify exactly what it is that is causing those anxieties, causing that distress, so that your young person, you know, that support can be put in place? So that's certainly what we did. We explored everything that we could, and you know, certainly there was some improvement, but she always struggled with those settings. And then when we finally got another setting, so, you know, my little girl's been to 6 different schools, and of them, you know, there was 4 of them weren't the best setting for her, despite working with school and school putting everything that they could in. So maybe you know, have those conversations with school. Is everything being done that can be done? Actually, is it that you need to explore an alternative setting, or maybe consider, like you've said, whether that needs to be homeschooled or not. But there's certainly lots of things that we need to understand their needs first. We need to understand why they're struggling and how they're struggling.
Thank you, Tracy, and unfortunately we've run out of time, so that was a brilliant presentation, and thank you so much, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it and found it